Hello, everybody. My name is Jenny Parks, and I'm the Vice President of Policy and Research at the Midwestern Higher Education Compact. Thank you so much for being here today. Our webinar is called Findings of the OER Course Marking Landscape Analysis Survey. And this is a survey that we have done in conjunction with our sister compact, WICHE, the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, to take a look at the practices across the nation in OER course marking. So we appreciate you being here. My co-presenters will introduce themselves in a moment. I wanted to remind everyone of a few housekeeping items. First of all, we are recording this presentation and it will be posted to the MEC website within the next few days. Also, the resources, any reference documents in this slide deck are already posted to the MEC website, and you can access those at any time. If you have any questions as they're making their presentation, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function. That helps us keep up with them a little more easily. And then finally, at the end, you will receive a survey. Please go ahead and let us know how we did on this webinar so that we can do even better on the next one. So thank you all for being here. And I will let my co-presenters introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Liliana Diaz-Saladukin, and I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education. So Regional Compact, just like MEC, just supporting the Western states and the U.S. Pacific and affiliated states.
And I am Gina Johnson. I'm Principal and Co-founder of Data Empower Consulting. I was the Principal Researcher on this survey project, and I'm very excited to talk you through what we found.
Thank you both so much. So let's get started by giving you the context in which we have done this work. The 4 regional compacts have come together in recent years to form NCOER, the National Consortium for Open Educational Resources. We have generous support from the Hewlett Foundation to do this work. And like I said, it's a partnership among the 4 educational higher ed compacts. Previously and now, it's coordinated at the Southern Regional Education Board, which is another one, SREB, another one of our sister compacts. You might recall a couple of years ago, there was a first report in what will become a series. One of the things that we've really tried to do with our work among the 4 compacts is to bring some consistency to the OER field in the way the data associated with it are reported. And of course, the first and biggest thing we tackled was how do you calculate cost savings and report out on them? We know that one of the issues with open educational resources is that everyone kind of counts them differently so that we don't ever have an apples to apples comparison of how much is saved. So we pulled together a group of folks from across the nation and really took a look at what practices were out there and decided to recommend some practices that would bring some consistency to that field. And that's the first part of our series. This research that we're doing right now is going to be that second set, which is to bring some consistency to course marking behaviors. Again, just as a reminder, in the student cost savings framework where you would report this apples to apples data, the first step we knew we would have to come back to it, is to identify the courses actually using OER and the sections using OER, because you can't calculate cost savings. There are a lot of other things you can't calculate, and I will let Liliana speak to those in a few minutes, but it's really a critical practice at the institutional system or even state level that we can bring as much consistency to this work as possible so that we have really good data on the other end to make the case for the use and the enhancement of programs using open educational resources. So once again, you'll see this is a page, if those of you who are familiar with that report, which is among the materials that we've posted to the website, a key enabler of doing this work is a good, robust system of course marking. So we're just trying to show you that it's all interrelated, and course marking helps you with multiple aspects of your OER practice. So now I'm going to turn it over to Liliana, because there are other things that we can learn if we have some good, robust practices that are consistent with OER course marking.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm very excited to be doing this work with MEC because we are trying to provide some recommendations for how the community could voluntarily standardize how they do course marking processes and categories. Partly because when we're trying to do these robust empirical research studies, there's a lot of challenges because institutions have different definitions for no cost, low cost, OER, zero textbook cost, so forth, as well as different processes for gathering and collecting course marking data. So that can be very difficult when we're trying to do analysis across institutions, across state lines. So one of the studies that MHEC conducted, and we are hopefully going to publish that journal. We conducted a pilot study last year, and we are submitting the publication into a journal. So hopefully those results will be out in the fall. But we did attempt to credential completion. We wanted to understand what the impact of specifically OER was on students' credential completion. So their associate's degree, bachelor's degree, certificates. One of the main challenges is that many institutions don't track OER in and of itself. It's usually rolled up into a course designation of no cost, low cost, which then is challenging to really parse out the impact of no cost, OER, and low cost materials from each other. So in this pilot study, unfortunately, we did have to roll up to that no cost, low cost designation. And we recruited several institutions. And again, we have similar data challenges that I just shared with you. However, we did have promising findings. In the institution, we were able to look at no cost, low cost. We found that students who attempted no cost, low cost were 2 times more likely to graduate compared to students who did not. So these are very promising findings. And we are hoping to expand that to a national study. So if we go to the next slide, we have the call out. So if you are at an institution and you know you have course marking data, we are looking for participants from 2 and 4 year institutions and or systems. We are going and we do use student level data to run the analysis. So there are some, data sharing agreements that we have to work through because we do upload that data into which is secure data environment where our researchers then run the analysis. The researchers then prepare an individualized report of the findings for your institution. And we're hoping to have data collection happen in February, March, and April, and hoping to complete the project in November 2024. It is free for your institutions and systems to participate. And we are hoping to explore 3 main research questions. How can OER be used as a retention and persistence strategy? Can OER be used as a degree pathway intervention? And are there disparate completion effects among different student populations? So I'll post my email in the chat. So if you're interested, you can reach out. And I'm very excited to be working with MHEC on this course marking work because this is pretty much their work is influencing this national study. So I'm very excited to be collaborating with other sister projects.
Liliana, I hate to interrupt, but we have a question. How many years of data are necessary in order to participate in the study?
So that's a fantastic question. So in our codebook, we're hoping we can get folks to share data back to 2014 because we are looking at a cohort model to see that completion. However, we know that many institutions didn't implement course marking until 2019 for many institutions. So we are asking institutions that if they are interested, regardless of when they started their course marking, that they reach out to me, because if you don't have enough to do a cohort analysis for completion, we could potentially do an analysis on progression. So we could look at markers like 15, 30, 60, 90 credits, 120, and see what the progression is for those students, even if you don't have enough data to look at completion. The second piece is that many of you have implemented course marking recently, but you were still tracking which courses used OER. So if you have that data prior to course marking, and your IR or data folks can actually crosswalk those courses used OER with the student level data, we can use that data as well. So it's a little bit of a heavier lift on your data folks, but if they have the capacity and the time and are willing to crosswalk that pre-course marking data with their student level data, then we can work with that.
Thank you so much. It's an exciting study. All right. So as I said, the next report in this series will be the findings from the survey we did across the nation, just to find out what are some of the pain points, what are some of the practices, what are some of the elements and components of course marking. And it took us a while to create the comprehensive survey, but it seems like we touched upon most of the really salient points, and the findings are very interesting. So I'm going to turn it over to Gina now.
Thanks, Jenny, and thank you, Liliana. I'd like to say it's been an absolute pleasure to work with folks on this project. I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology because I'm a methodologist. That's important. I want you to understand what it is that we did before we start sharing the results. And I will also open it up because of the nature of what we're going to present. It's sort of a progression through the survey itself and the results there. Do feel free to ask questions in the Q&A as I'm going through, and I'll ask Jenny to pause, and please interrupt me, Jenny, because I'm happy to answer questions as we go. I think it might be to some extent easier. We're not asking you to save questions till the end because you might have questions on sort of each piece of things as we go. So please, Jenny, just go off mute and interrupt me and ask questions as we go. And I might turn to Liliana and Jenny to help me answer some of the questions. I was the primary research on the survey, but you may have questions that expand into expertise of OER that Liliana and Jenny have as well. So in regard to the methodology, this survey was conducted in collaboration, as we said, with the NCOER partners. So meaning that each of them sent it out to their community using their tools, social media, email lists, listservs, these types of pieces. And so in that regard, it is somewhat of a convenient sample. We reached out to folks we know are interested in this because they have signed up for things or they are involved in something related to the 4 compacts. We had 164 respondents representing 29 states. And I say that I know we have other entities that are not states that are related to each of the compacts. We did not have respondents from something that wasn't a state. And so it really was 29 states that were represented. We explored course marking and validation processes. We'll go through that piece. Motivations for course marking. Why did you start doing this? Use of the data. We had a kind of a sub survey that we did to find out how folks were using the data. And we have some really nice links in the report related to that might be helpful to you if you're interested in using your data. And then course marking opportunities and challenges. As Jenny said, we asked folks to say what's working really well and what are you struggling with? What are some of the challenges you're encountering? And possibly unsurprisingly to those listening on this call, there were things that were in both columns. So things that are working well for some people might be a challenge for others. And therein lies the piece that we're really excited about in our next phase, which we'll talk about at the end, in how do we help the folks who are struggling with different pieces learn from the folks who have figured some things out and providing resources and expertise there. And so that's another link to the report, which we had on the first page. So the very first question we asked, which sort of divided then the respondents into what types of questions they would get after they asked this or answered this first one, was simply, does your institution or system have a method for marking courses that use OER? And so we had a little bit more than a third of respondents say they have implemented it. We also asked more than just yes or no, because we were curious who's in the formal planning stages, because we may have just sent our survey at the point in time where they haven't yet implemented it, but they're getting there and getting very close. Who's discussing it, and then who just hasn't even talked about this yet. And so that's where we wanted to really get some more descriptive analysis and figure out what's going on. But I'll say the next chunk of, or the next section of pieces I'm going to talk about include responses only from those who answered yes, that very piece on top. So the 60 people that answered yes are going to be sharing their responses on these next slides. But again, we're not trying to generalize and say, so now we think 37% of institutions and systems across the United States are doing so, because we know this is a bit of a convenient sample. And I suspect we may have more folks who are, or a higher percentage of respondents versus what's actually going on across the United States. So then we looked into the processes, and one of the first questions we asked was, at your institution or system, which of the following course marking designations includes OER? So to Liliana's point, some folks are saying OER is one piece. Some folks are placing OER in a bucket or another definition, like no cost or low cost. And so this slide breaks down the fact that about a third of respondents to this survey have OER as its own designation. So they could use those data. A student could potentially see that that's an OER course. That's one use of the data, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. Another use of the data is on the back end, the kind of research that Liliana is talking about when you're looking at student success, completion, other factors, and you want to look at how OER may impact that. About a third of the institutional respondents, you'll see it's a bit different for systems, about a third of the institutional respondents are able to tease that out because they have it as a separate designation. The rest, so the other 2/3, are looking at is captured as something else. And then in systems, we have a bit of a different structure. We had understandably a smaller response rate for systems. We wanted to represent systems as well in this data. Then we asked what individuals or units are involved in course marking at your institution. And I'll say that we asked this, and I'll pair this with the next slide in terms of our findings. We found mostly when we ask this question, and we do always understand anytime with the survey, we know that the person on the other end receiving and completing the survey is going to interpret a question. We try to be as clear as possible. But this is something I think that really came out for me as we asked a qualitative question, which is on the next slide, and I'll connect these two ideas together. That how folks interpreted the involved in course marking could be lots of things. And we intentionally asked it slightly vague so that we could find out who is it. And we wanted to sort of capture sort of the largest circle of folks. So in this case, what folks told us was mostly faculty, registrar, bookstore are the units or individuals that are involved in course marking, although library, instructional design, IT also have some involvement. What we're going to see on the next slide is that some different folks, when we asked what is the process, or what was the process, and this was more of a descriptive analysis then, and I'll turn to that so you can look at it, as we looked at theming, using all that qualitative data, doing some theming with that, talk about the themes in a second, but we found that there might have been different people involved in the process. And so that's something that we're exploring. And again, we'll talk about the next phase later on in this, but we're really exploring that and what does that look like and who's involved in developing the process, who's involved in implementing the process, and who's involved in using the data front end or back end. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we get to the use section. And so the umbrella, the circle gets a little bit bigger here when we talk about developing a process versus day-to-day implementing a process and marking courses. And so I say that because that's something that we're learning and we're using in our recommendation piece to say, maybe we want to broaden that umbrella and make sure we're reaching out so that the folks developing the process are in line and involved from the beginning with the folks implementing the process and the folks using the data. So in terms of process, we found some interesting pieces here, some understandably, and we'll get to policy and law in a little bit, but in some cases, state law, system level policy was enacted and an institution or a system was required to develop a process for marking courses. Sometimes it's participation in an external program that someone or a unit does, and they learn a lot about this and they learn about the benefits of this. And so that is the impetus. They may be getting some funding that goes along with that to develop this process. Many different people may have initiated it. In some cases, it's the OER lead. In some cases, it's faculty members, others who are thinking about the importance of persistence and completion. In some cases, and we have some links to this in the survey report, students were the impetus. It was student government that said, we want to see more OER. We want to see, in some cases, more affordable resources. And so for them, they went ahead and offered funding related to that. So more of these resources could be developed and used. And then, of course, the students want to know then which courses have these. And so in that end, marking is required in order for them to be able to see it and to be able to select those courses. So many different stories here. There is some crossover, but I think it's really important to tell each of those stories. In that call-out box, we also noted, and we did ask a question specifically about whether there was a committee or a work group. And we asked that because it's interesting to know whether there's someone, a champion, who works really hard and makes this happen. And sometimes there's more of a structure. Sometimes it's I'll call it lowercase c committee, a group of folks who get together and make something happen. Sometimes it's I'll call it uppercase C committee, where there is a very structured process at institutions or systems where things need to be approved, so to speak, and have that sort of approval by leadership and given that authority to do something like this. About 25% of institutions and systems do have some sort of committee or a work group. And based on the way things are shaking out and looking in our next phase, it might be a good idea, and we might recommend for folks to have some sort of formal structure like that, like a committee or work group, to make this happen. Then we asked where they're stored. So we got into some of the technical aspects of the process, most in a student information system. But here, I think it's very important to call out the difference, the red bar being responses from system respondents, the blue bars being the responses from institutional respondents. There is quite a difference. And again, we had a smaller response rate for the systems, but in this representative sample or representational sample, we do see a difference. In systems, we see that there's more in the course catalog, whereas institutions we see more in the bookstore, and that may be in relation to how each entity, whether it be institution or system, interacts with these different technology systems in terms of where the data are stored and displayed. Course marking validation process. This was something we were very interested in. So you develop this process. Some entity, be it a faculty member, be it an administrative assistant, be it a scheduling coordinator, is going to identify that a course has it. They're going to mark that the course has it in part of a process, so that then on the other end of things, the data can be stored, displayed to who they need to be displayed, pulled for research purposes, all of those other pieces. And so we were very interested in how do you ensure that the data are accurate? So the first question we had is whether there's training provided for those individuals responsible for marking those courses. About a third of institutions, 13% of systems said yes, that there is. Understandably, with systems, it may be that they are getting these data from institutions, so the system itself wouldn't necessarily provide that training. There would be potentially expectations that the institutions, who might be the ones gathering those data, sharing them with the system, are providing that training. I say that, so we take that one with a sort of a different lens. Then we asked if there's a process for checking that a course indeed does have OER if it is marked as having OER. About 42% in terms of the institutions said that there is a validation process. This theme, I will say, also came up in our qualitative analyses of what are some of the challenges. Understandably, some of the challenges include questionable data or changes that happen. Timing is very critical. I'm thinking of it may indeed have been the case that OER was planned for that course. Different things happened between it being marked and it being shown to students. For instance, a different faculty member may have taken over that course and that faculty member chose to use a different type of resource. And so this kind of unpacks, it's a very simple slide, but it unpacks sort of a complex piece of the puzzle in terms of what is really involved and how do we validate those data so they are correct for students, they are correct on the back end, so to speak, when we use those data for analyses later on. The next piece was sort of a subset. We invited the folks who said that they do have a course marking process to complete another very brief survey after the fact, with about, I think it had 3 questions. And really, this is where we wanted to dig into how are these data being used? And I'm using the term front end and back end to mean front end. Folks can see when they are, for instance, registering for courses, that certain course designations are true of these courses. That we call sort of a front end use of the data. And you'll see on here, 85% of the respondents to this survey said that they do use these data to provide information to students about course materials. Then there's sort of what we're calling more the back end use of the data. ROI, which Jenny talked about at the beginning, another aspect of this research and this work, whether they're using it for cost savings or ROI analyses, whether it's using the piece that Liliana is talking about and doing a lot of research on it, assessment of impact, on student outcomes. And then there's frankly the reporting requirement piece. As we said, some institutions and systems, one of the motivators for them to complete and create a course marking process was some sort of law, some sort of policy that they needed to implement. And oftentimes with those comes a reporting requirement back to some entity, whether it be a system or state. So we heard that 23% of the respondents to the smaller sub-survey shared that they do use it indeed to comply with reporting requirements. I think this is so interesting, and we have some links. So I do recommend that you go ahead and look at that report, even beyond kind of the slide deck. The slide deck might be useful for you, but the report itself, we have some links in there. The University of Missouri St. Louis generously allowed us to share a link to their resource on doing analyses of ROI with OER, and the University of Nebraska Omaha shared a study that they have conducted on student success and OER. So these are examples, resources that are available to you, and those are linked in the report. Then we get to technology. So we asked a few questions about, so of course there's a process, and in that process, technology is necessarily involved. We hope that it makes the process smoother. We know from previewing again some of folks' obstacles that it doesn't always make it smoother, but we wanted to ask some questions to better understand the technology aspects, the student information systems and other systems in which these data reside and in which they're used to front end show students, back end be pulled and used for analyses or other decision making. So 42% of institutions said that they needed to make changes to their SIS or other software in order to mark courses. I think it's interesting that 32% said they didn't. And so they had systems that had the necessary requirements in place to go ahead and make those changes and develop their course marking system. 26% understandably responded unsure because the person taking the survey may not have been involved in that technical aspect of the process development. But some of the necessary changes, so again, of those 42% of institutions, 71% of systems who said that there were changes that were needed to be done. Some of the themes there that they shared in more of a qualitative response, they needed to add a designator or attribute. In some cases, they used one that already existed. They just kind of shifted it and let everyone know that's the one that's inside the system, what that looks like. Some of them needed to change, again, that front end aspect, what that label would look like for students, because in that case, it's critical that what that outward facing label looks like is something that is understandable to the folks who are going to use it. And then some said that there was changes that needed to be made in connecting systems. So maybe the back end, there was one aspect and then they needed to make a change so that when those data were transitioned into that front facing information that students need to access, there were some changes that needed to be made in terms of those systems communicating with one another. So summarize this piece, it is likely, for those of you who have not yet tackled this process and development of this process, likely that technology changes will need to be made. However, in a lot of cases, it was not burdensome. It was something that if you had the right folks on that committee with you, they were able to tackle that aspect and use technology in a way that made this process relatively smooth. So then we wanted to find out from folks what their motivations were. Partly, admittedly, because we believe in the importance of this, as Jenny showed, as Liliana is talking about, we know the importance of collecting these data in order to do ROI analyses that are accurate, in order to study how these OER aspects impact student success and completions. And so we were curious why folks are motivated, because maybe there's things that we all can do collectively to ensure motivation for other institutions to be able to develop this process themselves, institutions and systems. So the first question we had is, are there policies, are there laws on the books that require you to develop a process to mark courses? And so the green bar is state policy, the red bar system policy, and the blue bar institution policy. And understand that some of these may overlap. In some cases, of course, we heard from folks that said there's a state policy and our system policy is to follow the state policy, and or our institution policy is to follow the system policy. And so there is some overlap on some of these pieces. But we found it very interesting that 40% of, and this is where we break down those who are marking courses, those who are not marking courses, but they're in the planning stages, the formal planning stages, and then those who are not marking courses, they're discussing it, whether there is a policy in place. So really the only area that has a state policy, I guess not too surprisingly, are those who have developed a process to mark courses. Do have 40% did say that there is a state policy. What I think is interesting about that, and sometimes we don't do this enough with data, is that 60% don't have that. And so that is to say, it's not that all of these institutions that are doing it because some external entity has told them it is absolutely required. Some of them are doing it because they have motivation to do this. And so I find this interesting because, as I said, we were looking at different motivations to think about how can we, as an entity, as folks who care about this, think about motivating those institutions and systems who haven't yet developed a process, that it can be mandated. That is one thing that can work. It can also be something that rolls up from either inside the system or inside the institution. I will also highlight the call out box there, which is a link to the Spark OER State Policy Tracker. This is a great resource where it's shared how many states have policies related to these aspects, and then also what the actual language in there is. So Jenny, it looks like there's a question.
Hi, yeah. And I think I might have, I'm not sure I'll have it at the right place in the slides, but it says, does the report identify which institutions changed or did not change their systems to mark courses?
Change it in a...
Did they use the SIS technology? I'm not exactly sure what that's referring to, sorry.
Yeah, my guess is, and please, if you want to clarify, type more in the Q&A, but my guess is because we asked that question, we said SIS and or other technology. We didn't necessarily say, ask a question of just SIS and ask a question of just other technology. We didn't quantitatively separate those out. We kind of lumped those technology aspects together, partly because we suspected that there would be multiple technology systems that would be involved in this, and we didn't necessarily, knowing that the folks responding to this survey might not be the IT or educational technology person who actually had to change all of those pieces. We did not break that detail out quantitatively. We do have some data and information in our, when I get at the end, when I get to the challenges, the obstacles, and what's working well, we do have a little bit more detail about other technology systems that needed to be used, and we did share that in the report. And I will also preview and say, we'll talk at the end about what the next step is, but in our next step, in our sort of next report of results that's going to be coming out in the summer, we will have much more information in there about the different aspects of technology that are impacted. And I recommend the marking and open and affordable courses text that's available for free online, an open resource, understandably, that has case studies of, I think it's 10 or 11 different institutions and systems that have done this process, and they go into much greater detail about the actual technology that they have, the student information system they have, the other technology, maybe it's bookstore technology, and what they needed to do. They go into such depth as to say, this is the actual attribute that we used in our student information system and so forth. So while we didn't break that out, if I'm understanding the question correctly, we do have other resources that have some information about that, because understandably, it's not always just the student information system. You change an attribute in there and boom, you're done. In some cases, that might be the case, and that's great. In some cases, it's this system has to talk to this system, and then we had to make multiple changes in order for it to work. So I appreciate that question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Disclosure, I am also not an IT professional or ed technology professional, and so my knowledge of that is not as extensive as the folks, again, that are quoted in the marking and affordable courses and some of those other places where they actually talked to the professionals that made those changes. So more details there. Okay, finally, we're at the last two kind of pieces where we looked at qualitatively. We asked folks, we gave them as much room as they wanted to and were willing to type. And then we ran a qualitative analysis of themes. We asked what is working well. And to clarify in terms of methodology, we asked this of anyone who either said, yes, they are marking and they have implemented a system for marking courses, and either of the no's of no, but we're in the planning stage, or no, but we're talking about it. And I will say, understandably, most of the people who responded to the question were in those first two categories. Either they have developed it or they are in the planning stages. So they told us about what's working in terms of the actual development or the planning of the development. So these are broken down into areas of themes. The first one being resource allocation. And some of the things I'd like to highlight here are calling it out in a strategic plan, calling it out in strategy was something that folks said was critical to the success of this and something that was working well. By having it in this very important document that guides an institution or a system and its work, that was something that then allowed folks to have the resources, human and material resources, that they needed in order to get this done. I loved that called out multiple times a committed and helpful registrar. Again, those key folks who need to be champions for you and need to be helpful, and the effectiveness of an OER committee, which we're going to get into great detail in our next resource. The other piece, technology and processes, as I mentioned, this showed up in what's working well. It also showed up in some of the challenges, and we'll go over those details as well. But some of the things that are working well is folks felt like they had a really good handle on attributes, and it wasn't necessarily a cumbersome process to identify an attribute, add it to the system, and have those systems talk to one another so that it can appear for student needs, and so that can be used on the back end for research and decision making, and good workflow processes. So the technology can only do what the technology can do unless we have a workflow and a system that's developed and outlined. And so folks talked about the importance of that as well. Communications, another one, to be honest, that showed up in what's working well and also showed up in some challenges. In this instance, folks did say in some cases that they felt that there was great communication between the bookstore, the campus store, and the institution. And so that was a communication that was really important, because it is that the bookstore where students are going to see this marker when they're registering. And then communication with students was something that worked really well for some institutions. Students, if they are very interested in it, if they are some of the champions of it, if they are on the committees, if they are in the user test groups to see when you're adding in these attributes and these labels so students can see them, the more it's communicated to students, understandably, the more they're going to use it and be excited about the fact that it's there. Ease of use, a couple of the things highlight from there. Again, students and faculty in this case, very important folks to be thinking about how easy it is for them to use it. Faculty acknowledging it could also be administrative assistants, schedulers, those who are identifying what the resources are, those who are then filling out coding, acknowledging, identifying that these courses use these different types of materials. If you have a process that's easy for them to understand, it's much more likely that those data are going to be inputted on the front end so that students can then see it on their end and that front-facing aspect. So it needs to be easy for students to find it and understand what it is. So if they see OER and they don't know what the letters OER stand for, it's important to have that process and think about what a student's going to see in order to select the courses and identify those that have OER, low cost, no cost. Then there were some things in the theme that just didn't fit into a category. Some of those we list them other, but we felt like they were very important to include. What's working well for some is that it is signaling that these things are important. By them taking the resources, taking the time to develop this process, to highlight to students which courses have these types of materials, this is sending a signal to the institutional community, to the students, to faculty, to everyone else that this is of value and this is very important to the institution or system, and they're placing resources in this area. In that leads to some of these other bullet points in the same section that is showing, and they're able to use data to identify this. It's showing an increase in development and use of OER. It's showing or allowing them to reward departments who are increasing their use of OER. And so they're seeing this sometimes when that which is measured is valued. This is where they're showing, or that's which is valued as measured. This is where they're showing that aspect. And frankly, and I love this one as a data professional, it is providing useful data for the institution. And I think that's fantastic. And Liliana does too. I'll speak for Liliana since she's on mute, since she's doing a lot of this work and values these data. Finally, the obstacles. So what's working well, what is challenging for folks? And again, it might be true that it's the same things, and in one space it's working well, and in one space it's challenging. And this is where I think this community of professionals can learn from one another. It's not always going to work the way it does over here at another institution, but we can at least talk about how we overcome some of these obstacles. So you'll see the font had to be relatively small in the section on lack of support. This was a very common theme, lots of aspects to this, lots of ways of describing this. So as we said, not everyone is motivated by a policy or a law, but it was acknowledged that sometimes a policy or a law is a very good impetus to say, now we have to do this, because if someone at a very important level says we have to do this, it's a bit easier, understandably, to get the resources to follow through on some of these things. So there was a call out of that to say, hey, it would be great if there was state level policy. Jenny, yeah, I'm going to pause there. Is there a question?
Sure, yes. So did any of your institutions have textbook rental programs, or did you have any suggested data which might be helpful for a college that has this type of a program?
That's a great question. We did not call that out in the survey. So in terms of survey results and saying, those with the textbook rental programs said this, we did not do that, but I will once again recommend and say that there are resources, and in our next level of, or in our next phase of this research on this process, there definitely is a lot of discussion about how textbook rental fits in and what that looks like. And that just kind of calling ahead to the next box on this slide, even the definitional challenges, that is an aspect that's very important in this process to think about in terms of when we, because we realized it's a lot more than OER to Liliana's point at the beginning, calling out OER as its own is an important aspect. Also thinking about how all these, pictured as a Venn diagram, cross one another in terms of low cost, zero cost, all these other aspects. Textbook rental programs, of course, can definitely be one piece of that puzzle, and how that fits in terms of the definitional standards and how they are marked and how they are identified is really important. And then in terms of what that looks like to students is a different factor that we did not touch on in this survey. But again, marking open and affordable courses is a great resource. I will also say that we will have more on those types of questions and those types of factors in terms of definitional aspects of the course marking process in our next piece of this research. So
Thanks.
yeah, thanks for that question. There's so many, full disclosure, something I'm learning and really value learning as part of this project and being involved as a researcher on this project. So much nuance and so many aspects to providing students resources in creative ways to increase affordability, increase access and equity. And so I appreciate that question. And again, it hits on the learning from others who have already been there. Is a great question. So lack of support, a few other things just highlighting there. When there's no committee, there's no lead, you don't have involvement of faculty, you may not have the easiest relationship with information technology in this case. All of these pieces, I think, once again, highlight that importance of having a committee. And sometimes a lowercase c committee will do it. That works great. It's folks who roll up their sleeves and they get it done. And if that's what works best in your setting, that would be the suggestion. Sometimes it needs, and these are kind of the pieces on the higher end of that list. Sometimes it needs that more formal, there is a policy, this has to get done, or an administrative leadership saying, this is important, even if there isn't a policy, this is important. We're allocating folks' time to this. And so it can work either way. But I think what this list to me shows is that criticality of the support and the involvement of different aspects. So you may have a great committee, but if that one key unit is not involved in that committee, the process may break down. Second area of theme we found was definitional challenges. And I'll say, to highlight here, the importance and how critical it is to have this first step. You create your committee and then you have these conversations about definitions. And this is, thank you again for that question about textbook rental. This is where those types of things come in. If you have textbook rental, if you have the library paying for certain resources that are accessible to everyone or not, are there certain that are accessible to the first 5 who show up and can get them for free, versus are they truly an open education resource that are available to everyone? And so those definitions and defining that, this is also something that we heard in the process needs to be revisited. So it's not as if you can do that right up front and say, here's our definitions, and now we go through everything else. It may actually take a little bit of development of that workflow, and that process highlights the fact that, ooh, we don't have a tight enough definition there. Got to go back, get that definition in place, and then we can move through our process. So it is a bit iterative in that regard. That again highlights the more folks you have at that table, the more folks you have in that committee, the more likelihood you're going to have those voices saying, but what about, and you're going to be able to overcome the what abouts in your process so that it works more smoothly at the end of it. So as I said, technology and process, some folks said that's what's working well for them. And then some folks said that's where we're breaking down here. This is not working as well for us and it's causing some challenges. Change is hard. Change is challenging. And while technology we hope is agile, we know finances and other aspects make technology not always as agile as we would like it to be. And so making changes within systems is not easy. Some systems don't work well. Some systems, using a different definition of that word, systems of institutions, collaboratives of this institutions, some of them don't have a universal student information system across all their systems, or the institutions, excuse me. Their institutions are allowed to select their own student information system. And so when a system is trying to roll these data up into some sort of data set for use either on the front end or the back end, it is very difficult to work across PeopleSoft and Genzabar and all these other pieces. And so that adds a different level of complexity that I wanted to call out, because we did have system level respondents to this survey as well. Systems, using the other definition of that word in terms of data systems, they're not always talking to one another. And they don't always easily talk to one another, and that can absolutely be a challenge as well. No automation. Sometimes you have to do it very step by step at first, and the idea is to get it automated later. Sometimes you get stuck in that process and it's challenging to switch to a more automated process. And then marking by course and not by faculty, which will transition us. That's both a technology issue and a data input issue, that you may have the data and it may marked by this course and this section have this. But then if there's different faculty members that teach different sections of a course and different faculty members use different types of resources, if the system, data system in which you are working, or the technology system in which you're working, only allows you to place it by course rather than section, or in the section, the faculty member changes. These are all challenges that are acknowledged. It's that lovely process of you get your workflow all written down, and then there's that one thing that makes it challenging. So folks were highlighting this. I will say what I like to, a positive, a shining light on this, or a little rainbow, is that if you are to the phase that is what's challenging you, perhaps it's the case that you have the support, you've made the, developed the definitions, and so you've gotten past some of these other challenges. So I guess that's a bright spot. But it's not to say that that isn't a challenge that you also need to overcome. Relating to data input, a couple of things I want to highlight there is the timing of the data is so critical. Faculty may say, this is what I'm expecting, and then all of a sudden, those data are already in the registration system, but in the meantime, a faculty member has been pulled off that, put something else, and a different faculty member has been placed on there, and they have a different resource. So it is challenging to keep up with the timing aspect. And then finally, awareness. So I kind of connected this to that communication piece, where some folks said the communications were working well. Some folks also highlighted the fact that awareness is a challenge. Students don't know what OER means. Students don't know that we have these labels within the system. And so figuring out ways to communicate this to students so that they know it's available and there when they're making their registration choices is critical. And then flip side, faculty don't necessarily know. Are we supposed to label these? How are we supposed to label these? When are we supposed to label these? What does that process look like? Is another challenge that folks highlighted as well. I'm going to quickly go through next steps, and then we have a few more minutes if folks have other questions. As Jenny said at the beginning, MHEC has its initial ROI work. We did this survey that as another piece of the puzzle. Liliana and Witchy are doing some other work related to this. It's all coming together. And then our next steps in terms of MHEC in partnership with Witchy is we have been exploring this topic since September with an expert group of folks who have done this, who have experienced some of these challenges, who have figured out what's working well for them. We are in the current process of compiling and creating a set of recommendations based on those conversations with those experts and other resources that we have received either from institutions and systems or from entities that have done research in this area and are looking at promising practices. And we will be publishing a report of those recommendations, which will be that next level of information, some of it based on this survey, a lot of it based on resources and conversation with that expert panel. And we expect that report to come out in early summer of 2024. I'm very excited about that piece. So at this point, with 5 minutes left, I'm going to pause, see if there's any other questions, see if Jenny or Liliana have something else they would like to share about this work.
Well, Liliana, you're the one engaged in a lot of the research. I mean, do you have a timeline for when that paper might be published?
I'm hoping it'll come out this fall. We are submitting it this month for publication, but it is a journal, so they has to go through the appropriate peer review process, and we know that can take some time. However, the national study, we are hoping to release that in November 2024. As we're not publishing that in a journal, we're just going to be doing a white paper on that. So look out
Great.
for that this coming fall.
Very exciting. Well, does anyone else have any more questions to put in the Q&A? I don't think I am misspoken when I say this is an incredibly complex set of practices. And as with so many things related to OER, it really does take a team approach to figure it out and do it well. But it builds a lot of good relationships at the institution and can bring about a lot of good, promising practices. And again, the more that we can all move just a little bit in increments towards some consistency, it does allow us to aggregate data and really make some bigger, wider reaching claims about the impact that lower cost and openly licensed materials have on students and their learning. So I'm pretty excited about the work. Well, I think that's it. Thank you both so much for presenting here today and for sharing this work with us. I really appreciate it. And as always, reach out to us if you have additional questions, and look for all those resources that we'll be posting and sending to you. And don't forget to fill out that little survey to let us know how we're doing. Thank you all so much. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.